Hey, it's Coach Anderson here again from Mississippi Public Broadcasting Online U.S. History from 1877 to present. Today we'll pick up with lesson number 5 in Unit 7, the Roaring Twenties. And what we'll talk about is something most people call the Harlem Renaissance. What we're going to talk about is African Americans' influence on the period. So when we start, once again, we have the unit focus question we won't answer today, but we will at the end of the unit. So what characteristics of the 20s made it distinctly different than the previous decades in the United States? Vocabulary, of course, as we go over the vocabulary, as we reach each individual vocabulary term, we'll try to give you an explanation of what it means. If not, go ahead and look it up yourself. The lesson focus question for lesson number 5, the African American influence on the 1920s, is in what ways did African American art provide a backdrop for the 1920s? Now, when we're talking art here, we're talking about writing, we're talking about music, we're talking about poetry, we're talking about acting, so we're talking about anything, of course, in the arts themselves. The Do Now activity, of course, take out your journals, and in your journals, you should write down the following reflective question. It says, Mississippi has been called the birthplace of America's music. What musical influence gave it that title? Well, when you look at that particular question, it says, what musical influence gave Mississippi that title? Well, it's because of the blues. So when you look at the blues, of course, we think of that as being the mother of American music, in that it gave birth to rock and roll. So when you look at the blues and you think about jazz and all those particular influences, we're going to find that the blues, of course, is going to probably be a hybrid of sorts of those types of genres. So when we're looking at music in the 1920s, we're going to find that not blues, but jazz is going to be the backdrop of course, of a lot of these music scenes in these clubs in the 1920s with people like Bessie Smith and Duke Ellington. We'll talk about those people here in just a little while. The Harlem Renaissance. The 1920s brought the rebirth of African American culture to northern cities like Harlem, New York. The Harlem Renaissance writers expressed a defiance of racism and their contempt for racism. Harlem Renaissance literature tried to instill a sense of pride, defiance, determination, and confidence in black people, setting the attitude for the upcoming civil rights movement. So when we look at the Harlem Renaissance, we're talking about a rebirth, which was really not a rebirth, because to be a rebirth, it means it had to have been born before. So we're looking at the birth, basically, of the African American literary art form. So when we talk about it, once again, it was based on the idea of contempt, which means dislike for racism in this particular case. Here are some of the Harlem Renaissance writers of note. County Cullen on the left, of course, and then you have Claude McKay. Harlem Renaissance writers that you may have heard of, Langston, Hughes, of course, and Elaine Locke. The Jazz Age is also a nickname given to the 1920s. The 1920s were called the Jazz Age by many because jazz exploded during the period. Jazz and blues music brought whites and blacks alike to places like the Cotton Club, one of the few places where blacks and whites alike would sometimes enjoy the same party atmosphere. Blacks would perform and whites would dance. So the Negro Theater also flourished during the Jazz Age with Paul Robeson, who becomes a very noteworthy actor, African-American actor during the period. And he is the first black actor, of course, to make it to Broadway. Here you have pictures of some of the jazz musicians of the time. You have Louis Armstrong on the right, and then you have Louis Armstrong on the left, and then you have George Gershwin, who is not white, not black, of course, on the right. But their influence during this particular period, and their music influence on this particular period, provides a backdrop for one of the most fun times in American history. On the left, you have Bessie Smith, one of the queen of the blues, and then on the right, you have Duke Ellington, who's a band leader that did a lot of direction in the Cotton Club. Here you have actor Paul Robeson, who was a Broadway actor. So when you look at the fight for civil rights during the 1920s, now we're going to find that once again, we already talked about there being a resurgence of the Ku Klux Klan, of course, in the northern cities. And when you think about it, one of the things that brought African Americans, of course, to these northern cities, of course, was World War I, through a period called the Great Migration. And when they get there, we're going to find that there are going to be jobs, of course, in abundance. And we're going to look at a very good economic time during the war, of course, for African Americans. And so we're going to see that after this particular period of this Great Migration, there's still going to be some issues. Now, African Americans are probably going to do a whole lot better, of course, in northern cities than they did, of course, in the South. But there's still going to be some issues in terms of looking at civil rights. The NAACP use of the courts and protests reduced lynchings because of public outrage, and even was successful preventing Republican Judge John Parker from being elevated to the Supreme Court because of some of his ideas about lynching. So when you look at it, even though there's going to be some progress during the 1920s, we're still going to find that there's going to be, increased amount of lynchings during the 1920s, but we're going to find that economically, some African American cities are going to, African Americans in those northern cities are going to do quite well. The return to Africa movement. The NAACP, of course, used the court system to fight to try to improve the plight, of course, of African Americans. Plight, of course, would be their condition that they were living under. And then there would be people like Marcus Garvey. Marcus Garvey believed that in something called Negro nationalism. And he said that, or his belief was that as long as African Americans remained in the United States of America, they would never get a fair shake, and they would never, of course, be looked upon, of course, as being the equals of their white counterparts. So what he proposed to do is to return, for all African Americans, of course, to return to Africa, create their own, own country, own nation, and of course live, back in Africa. Now, out of that, a little bit later, I think what we'll get, of course, is a free nation of Liberia, but it won't necessarily be, it's not going to be because of Garvey's influence, but we're going to find that a lot of people, of course, are going to think about that, of course, as being an option. Garvey was convicted of mail fraud in 1923 and deported back to Jamaica in 1927. So because he alienated a lot of blacks, a lot of black people, of course, and then because he becomes the target of the federal government, the Back to Africa movement, of course, will slowly go away, and Marcus Garvey will go back or be put back in Jamaica. Lesson focus questions: in what ways did African American art provide a backdrop for the 1920s? African American music was the art form that provided the soundtrack of the 1920s. African American music was on prominent display in white clubs and jazz clubs throughout the period, and African American poetry and theatrical productions made their way into the mainstream and to Broadway. Remember what we said about Paul Robeson. So when you look at the 1920s, African Americans are, an instrumental part of the 1920s. And the reason why we say that is because when you look at the African American art form, when it comes to music, when it comes to writing, when it comes to poetry, when it comes to acting, we're going to find that we're going to have some significant contributions that will be made by African Americans. That concludes lesson 5, and what we wanted to do, of course, is to remind you once again, this is America's history, which means it's your history, so don't take my word for it. Do your own research, and then come back, of course, and reach your own conclusion. And remember, it is your history. Do your own research, and we'll see you next time at Mississippi Public Broadcasting Online, U.S. History from 1877 to present. See you next time.